17-year-old Aaron Mills sat in court with a grin that didn't belong in a room built for truth. He rolled his shoulders, stared at the judge as if she were a substitute teacher, and let out a soft laugh that made the gallery flinch. He killed his mother, and he thought a smirk could shrink the crime. He believed his age would be his parachute, but a single fingerprint on a warm steel pistol had already written his future. He didn't know his sentence was already waiting. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now, and tell us what you think below. This is how it all began. Sandra Mills woke before sunrise, the quiet queen of a quiet house on Maple Street. She brewed coffee and straightened the notes for Monday's library hour, never guessing that the boy she raised had been rehearsing betrayal. Aaron's bed was made too neatly. His window stood open a fraction toward the morning. At 10:13 a.m., a message buzzed on Sandra's phone. "Thanks for everything, Mom." She smiled and replied, "Love you." A minute later, the kettle still hummed on the stove, and a single shot carved silence into the walls. Outside, the neighborhood breathed like nothing had happened. Inside, fate had turned. Sandra Mills had always believed that patience could fix anything. As a single mother of two, she juggled her job at Willow Ridge High's library with the chaos of raising a teenage son who had grown sharper and colder with every passing year. Her daughter Lily still clung to bedtime stories and morning hugs, but Aaron had changed. He wasn't the boy who used to sit cross-legged at the kitchen table begging for one more cookie. Now, he came home late, his phone glued to his hand, his eyes glassy with defiance. Neighbors called her the heart of Maple Street, the woman who brought cupcakes to every bake sale and checked on the elderly couple next door. They never saw the way she flinched when Aaron slammed his door or the quiet arguments that echoed after midnight. Still, she told everyone, he's just figuring himself out. Love made her blind to the growing danger under her own roof. Aaron was 17, tall, athletic, a soccer star with charm that teachers admired. He knew how to smile just right for adults. But that charm hid a resentment that festered. He hated rules, hated limits, and lately hated his mother's control. When she found a small stash of cash and asked where it came from, he sneered, "You wouldn't understand." His arrogance wasn't teenage rebellion anymore. It was something darker, rehearsed, deliberate. On the last Friday she was alive, Sandra stopped by the grocery store after work. She picked up Aaron's favorite cereal and a new notebook for Lily. At the checkout, she laughed with the cashier, unaware that Aaron had already decided this weekend would change everything. That night he texted a friend, "She's cutting me off. I'll fix it soon." The friend didn't reply. Saturday morning bloomed soft and ordinary. The sun poured through the lace curtains, glinting on the family photos that lined the staircase. Aaron's soccer trophies, Lily's spelling bee ribbons, Sandra's framed degree. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen. Sandra leaned on the counter, scrolling through her recipes. She had no idea that upstairs her son was cleaning a pistol he'd bought weeks earlier from a classmate's older brother. Lily was still asleep when it happened. A sharp pop cracked through the stillness, followed by the soft hiss of boiling water. The neighbors heard nothing but the hum of lawnmowers and birdsong. When Lily came downstairs minutes later, she thought her mother had dropped something. Then she saw the blood pooling by the refrigerator. She screamed so loudly it shattered the calm of Maple Street. Police sirens arrived fast, their red lights bouncing off every window. Sandra Mills was pronounced dead at the scene. The house, once filled with warmth, was now a sterile crime scene lined with tape and quiet horror. Aaron was nowhere to be found. By noon the detectives had their first clue, a fingerprint on the kettle's handle, a smear too perfect to be random. Sergeant Ramirez, a man who'd seen every kind of cruelty, looked at the print and whispered, "He didn't even try to hide it." That same afternoon, Aaron's car was spotted on a forest road 30 miles north. Inside the trunk, officers found a duffel bag with cash, gloves, and a pistol, the same caliber as the bullet that had ended his mother's life. But it wasn't the evidence that stunned them. It was the arrogance of his next move. At 6:02 p.m., Aaron posted a photo on social media, a blurry image of a sunset with the caption, "Freedom looks good on me." When police finally caught up to him 2 days later, sitting on a park bench eating chips, he looked bored. "You took long enough," he said. "So what's the big deal?" His calm was more chilling than any confession. In the interrogation room, Aaron leaned back, yawning, as detectives read him his rights. When asked why he fled, he shrugged. "I needed air." When they told him his fingerprint matched the murder weapon, he smiled wider. "Guess I left a souvenir." It was the moment every officer in that room felt a flicker of rage. Outside, Willow Ridge mourned. Inside, the case had only just begun. The evidence was airtight, but what truly haunted them wasn't the crime. It was the boy's complete lack of soul. And when he finally faced Judge Helena Whitman, he would learn that arrogance might play well on social media, but not in her courtroom. The gavel hadn't yet fallen, but fate was already reaching for it. The smile that mocked justice was living on borrowed time. Before the headlines, before the mugshot, there was a mother who believed love could heal rebellion. Sandra Mills lived for her children. Every day of her 42 years stitched together by duty and devotion. Her world was small but warm. A 2-story brick home, a job she adored at the local high school library, and 2 kids who once filled that home with laughter. To anyone passing through Willow Ridge, the Mills family looked picture perfect. A hard-working mom, a bright daughter, and a gifted son whose future seemed carved in gold. Neighbors recalled how Sandra would wave every morning from her front porch, hair tied back, travel mug in hand. She organized reading programs, volunteered at food drives, and was the quiet glue of the neighborhood. To those who knew her best, she was gentle but strong, the type who forgave quickly and believed second chances could turn anyone around, especially her son. Aaron Mills had been her pride. Tall, confident, a soccer prodigy with offers from college scouts already hovering in the mail. His smile once melted the hearts of every teacher. But lately, that charm had hardened into something else. He walked with a swagger that bordered on defiance, his eyes darting away when his mother spoke, his words sharper, colder. The boy who used to hug her after every match now looked at her as though she were the enemy. There were warning signs, but they appeared ordinary at first. Late nights, mysterious absences, unexplained bruises, money missing from her wallet. Sandra blamed stress, hormones, the growing pains of adolescence. She told her colleagues, "He's just testing boundaries." Yet deep down, she felt the distance widening, a shadow crawling over the light she once saw in him. In the months before the murder, their relationship turned fragile. Sandra found messages on his phone about quick money, about plans he wouldn't explain. When she confronted him, Aaron laughed in her face. "You're paranoid, Mom. You don't know the world like I do." It was the first time she felt fear, not of him, but for him. That fear made her kinder, gentler. She thought if she just loved him harder, he'd come back. But Aaron didn't want saving. He wanted freedom and money. He'd grown tired of curfews and lectures, of his mother's insistence that he focus on school. He saw her rules as chains, her care as control. What he didn't know was that Sandra had been saving money to send him to a prestigious boarding school, hoping it would steer him back on course. To Aaron, that decision looked like exile. On the last morning of her life, Sandra woke early, as always. She brewed her coffee, set out Lily's breakfast, and looked out at the dew-covered lawn. It was just another Saturday, soft sunlight painting her kitchen in gold. She sent a quick text to Aaron, who hadn't come home the night before. "You okay?" No response. At 10:13 a.m., her phone buzzed. It was from Aaron. Just 2 words. "Thanks, Mom." She smiled, relieved he'd at least answered. "Love you," she replied, unaware that he was already walking up the driveway, gloves in his pocket, and murder in his heart. The neighbors saw nothing unusual. Mrs. Henderson across the street waved as Aaron slipped into the house. He waved back. A minute later, a muffled sound, like a cupboard slamming. Silence followed. By noon, Sandra was gone. Lily, just 12 years old, found her mother lying beside the kitchen counter. The kettle was still warm, steam fading into the air. The phone was on the floor, cracked. Lily's screams shattered the calm of Maple Street. When police arrived, they found no forced entry, no robbery, no sign of struggle. The only thing missing was Aaron. His car was gone, his bed perfectly made, and his window slightly open. As if he wanted to be found later, as if he wanted the story to look clean. Neighbors gathered behind the yellow tape, whispering the unthinkable. A mother murdered in her own home and her teenage son missing. The detective's eyes scanned the photos on the fridge, Aaron holding a soccer trophy, Sandra smiling with her arm around him. Sometimes, Sergeant Ramirez muttered, evil doesn't break in, it's raised inside. That evening, forensic teams combed through the kitchen. A fingerprint glistened on the kettle's handle. It would later match Aaron's. But even before the results came in, everyone on Maple Street already knew. By nightfall, the hunt began. Police traced his phone to a forest road 30 miles north. His car sat abandoned, a duffel bag in the back seat containing gloves, cash, and a loaded pistol. Nearby, fresh footprints led toward the woods. The town that had once celebrated Aaron Mills now whispered his name in disgust. A boy who had everything had thrown it all away. For freedom, for pride, for something no one could quite explain. As the investigation deepened, one thing became clear. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was planned, calculated, cold. And when Aaron was finally caught, his grin would become the face of cruelty, a smirk that dared justice to stop him. The story of the perfect home on Maple Street was over. What followed would shake the nation. The police arrived to find a home that looked peaceful from the outside. White shutters, trimmed hedges, a mailbox painted with the words, "The Mills Family." But as soon as they crossed the threshold, the illusion shattered. A coffee mug lay shattered on the floor, its contents staining the rug beside a spreading pool of blood. The air smelled faintly of gunpowder and burnt toast. On the counter, the kettle was still whistling softly, its handle glistening with a single smeared fingerprint. Sandra Mills had been shot once in the back of the head. The trajectory was clean, deliberate, almost professional. There were no defensive wounds, no sign of struggle. She hadn't even turned around. The medical examiner would later confirm what everyone already suspected. She never saw it coming. Lily, trembling under a blanket in the back of a ambulance, could barely speak. Her words came in fragments. "I heard a pop." Then it was quiet. When detectives asked where Aaron was, she whispered, "He was supposed to be with his friends." She didn't know that her brother's car had already been found 30 miles away. Inside that car, officers discovered a duffel bag stuffed with clothes, $4,800 in cash, and a black handgun fitted with a homemade silencer. On the back seat sat Aaron's soccer medal, its ribbons stained with a faint smear of blood. The sight made Sergeant Ramirez exhale sharply. "This wasn't panic, he said. "He packed for a trip." Forensics moved fast. Gunshot residue was found on a jacket in Aaron's closet. His laptop contained recent searches that read like a confession: how to hide fingerprints, homemade suppressor design, life insurance payout for minors. It was methodical, chilling. He had planned every detail down to his escape route. Still, the question lingered. Why? Sandra wasn't rich, and Aaron had everything a teenager could ask for: a car, friends, a promising future. But greed has a strange way of finding home in empty hearts. 2 weeks before the murder, Sandra had increased her life insurance policy, naming Aaron as the beneficiary. To her, it was a safety net. To him, it was a target. When the detectives entered Aaron's room, they found his bed neatly made, his soccer posters still on the wall, and his computer open on a message draft to an unknown contact. "After tomorrow, I'll be free." That phrase would haunt the investigation for months. The crime scene unit worked in silence. The fridge was covered in magnets spelling out the words, "Family, forever." One of them had fallen to the floor, stuck to a metal spoon in the blood. Small details like that, the domestic normality twisted by violence, would stay with them long after the evidence bags were sealed. By late afternoon, the coroner's van pulled away. Neighbors huddled in the street, arms crossed, eyes wide. Some cried, others stared in disbelief. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who lived next door, kept repeating, "He waved to me, he smiled." It was unthinkable that the same boy who had helped her carry groceries 2 days ago had murdered his own mother. When the autopsy confirmed the bullet matched the pistol found in Aaron's duffel bag, the case became undeniable. The fingerprint on the kettle sealed it, a single print, half-wiped, pressed deep enough to leave a partial ridge. Forensic examiners lifted it and ran it through the database. The match came back within hours. Aaron Mills. Detectives traced his phone to a park bench 2 towns over. When they approached, he was eating chips and scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened. He looked up, recognized the badge, and smirked. "Guess this is about my mom," he said. His tone was light, casual, as if he'd been caught skipping class. At the station, Detective Ramirez stared at him across the table. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked. Aaron leaned back and smiled wider. "Yeah," he said, "and I'd do it again if I had to." He refused a lawyer, refused remorse, refused to speak his mother's name. The officers in the room had dealt with killers before, gang members, addicts, hardened men who'd spent decades behind bars. But they'd never seen arrogance like this in someone so young. News of the murder spread fast. Headlines painted Aaron as a smirking teen killer. Reporters crowded outside the police station. Social media exploded with outrage. How could a son do this? What went wrong in that house? Where was his father? Meanwhile, Lily was placed under the care of relatives. Her life, once defined by laughter and bedtime stories, was now shadowed by trauma she couldn't name. She would later testify in court, her voice shaking, saying, "He didn't even look sad. He looked proud." The crime scene on Maple Street was sealed for weeks. Even after the blood was scrubbed away, the house felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by betrayal. Every photo on the wall, every empty chair whispered the same question: what turns love into hatred? As Aaron awaited trial, he spent his days in a juvenile detention center, smirking through every interview, mocking guards, and calling himself the kid who fooled them all. But behind that grin was a truth he couldn't escape. No smile could save him from what was coming. The courtroom was waiting, and Judge Helena Whitman was not the kind to be mocked. The gavel was already raised, and soon it would fall. By the time the sun rose over Willow Ridge the next morning, the story had already flooded every news channel. 17-year-old arrested for the murder of his mother. The image that played on repeat was of Aaron Mills being led into custody, hands cuffed behind his back, that same smirk stretching across his face as reporters shouted his name. To the public, it looked like arrogance. To detectives, it looked like a challenge. Sergeant Miguel Ramirez had been a homicide investigator for 15 years. He'd seen tears, panic, denial, but never this kind of calm. "He's enjoying it," Ramirez muttered as he watched Aaron through the one-way mirror. The teenager leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers in rhythm, eyes fixed on the ceiling. When the door opened, he smiled like he'd been waiting for company. "So," Aaron began, "am I supposed to cry now or something?" Ramirez sat down opposite him. "No," he said. but you could start by telling me why your mother is dead." Aaron's eyebrows lifted slightly. "She's dead?" he asked, feigning surprise. Then he smirked. "Wow, that's tragic." The detective didn't rise to the bait. He opened a file and slid across the table a photo. The gun from the duffel bag. "Your prints are on the handle. Same caliber as the bullet that killed her. You want to tell me how that happened?" Aaron leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Maybe she touched it." "She didn't," Ramirez said evenly. "But you did. And you ran. That tells me you knew exactly what you'd done." Aaron's smirk faltered for just a second, not from guilt, but irritation at being cornered. "You think you've got everything figured out," he said. "You don't know me." Ramirez held his gaze. "Oh, I know you," he replied quietly. "You're the kind who thinks rules don't apply." While detectives questioned him, the forensics team tore through every piece of evidence. The gun had residue linking directly to the kitchen crime scene. The duffel bag contained a printed copy of Sandra's new insurance policy, her signature still wet from the notary stamp, her name, his as the sole beneficiary. On Aaron's laptop, investigators found hundreds of deleted searches restored from the hard drive. Can minors collect insurance money? Best countries to move without extradition. Can you fake insanity? It wasn't impulsive. It was strategy. His phone pinged cell towers from the Mills house to the forest clearing where his car was abandoned, confirming he drove straight there after the murder. The timing was surgical. 11 minutes from death to escape. When the results came back from the lab, the evidence left no room for doubt. Gunshot residue on his jacket, his mother's DNA on the pistol grip, hair fibers matching her scarf woven into the gun's trigger guard. Every thread tied back to him. But Ramirez wasn't satisfied with proof. He wanted motive. He needed to know why. When he returned to the interrogation room, Aaron was whistling. "Let's say I did it," Aaron said suddenly, breaking the silence. "What then?" "Then," Ramirez said slowly, "you live with it." Aaron chuckled. "I'm 17. I'll be out by 21. You can't stop me." Those words hit Ramirez like a punch. He realized then what he was dealing with. Not confusion, not fear, but a teenager who believed the law couldn't touch him. "You think this is a game?" he asked. Aaron shrugged. "Everything is." Outside the room, prosecutors were already preparing to charge him as an adult. The arrogance he wore like armor would be the very thing that ensured it. The coroner's report arrived that afternoon. Sandra had been shot at close range while standing at the counter, coffee mug in hand. There were no signs she turned around. The round entered just above her neck, angled downward. The shot of someone standing behind her, calm, steady, deliberate. No tremor, no panic. At the Mills home, forensic teams continued combing through the kitchen. On the table, they found a single sticky note in Sandra's handwriting. "Talk to Aaron about the insurance forms. Soon." That small reminder spoke volumes. A mother trying to protect her son, unaware it had already cost her life. By evening, the house had emptied again, leaving only echoing silence and yellow tape fluttering in the wind. Ramirez stood in the doorway, looking at the framed family photos still hanging in the hall. In one, Aaron was grinning, arms slung around his mother and sister, after winning a soccer championship. The irony stung. He turned to his partner and said quietly, "He didn't just kill her for money. He killed her because he could." As night settled over Willow Ridge, the story began to spread across the nation. The smirking teen killer. People shared clips of Aaron's arrest online, some out of outrage, others out of morbid fascination. But what they didn't see was the weight behind the case, the small-town heartbreak that lay buried beneath headlines and hashtags. For the investigators, this wasn't over. There was still the question of whether Aaron had help. The mysterious second fingerprint found inside his duffel bag hinted at another person's presence. Someone had touched that bag after the murder, someone who hadn't yet been found. And so, even as the evidence piled up, the story grew more tangled. A dead mother, a missing ally, a son without remorse. Ramirez knew one thing for certain. Arrogance this deep doesn't appear overnight. It's taught, nurtured, rewarded. Somewhere along the line, someone told Aaron Mills that consequences were optional. But in Judge Helena Whitman's courtroom, they would learn otherwise. The smirk that mocked the law was about to meet its match. Detectives called it one of the most chilling cases they'd ever seen, not because of the brutality, but because of the precision. Aaron Mills hadn't acted in rage. He'd acted in calculation, and every keystroke on his laptop told the story. When forensic analysts cracked open Aaron's encrypted folders, they didn't find random teenage downloads. They found an itinerary, a plan mapped out like a military operation. He'd titled it Exit Plan Freedom 22. It included timestamps, locations, and even projected costs for bus tickets and food for first 30 days. The date beside the word execution matched the morning his mother died. Detective Ramirez read it aloud in the evidence room, his jaw tightening with each line. He wasn't improvising. He was staging his life like a show, he said, and he wanted an audience. Digital forensics painted the rest of the picture. Aaron's last browser activity before the murder wasn't frantic or emotional. It was coldly practical. How to clean gunpowder residue, ways to erase fingerprints from metal, life insurance waiting period after death. Each search time-stamped in perfect sequence, leading up to 9:58 a.m. Exactly 15 minutes before the fatal shot. His phone told an even darker story. Texts to his friend Trevor 2 nights before the murder read, "Mom's tightening control. I'm done playing by her rules." Another followed, and so, an hour later, "When this is over, I'll be rich." Trevor told police he thought it was a joke. He never imagined those words would turn into headlines. Investigators also uncovered a string of messages between Aaron and an online user named Ghost23. The conversations were cryptic, filled with talk about freedom, power, and final steps. But tech specialists soon discovered the truth. The messages weren't from anyone else. Aaron had been talking to himself using a second account. It was like watching someone create their own accomplice. A split dialogue between sanity and fantasy. When the prosecution saw that evidence, they knew motive would no longer be the hardest part to prove. It was premeditation, written in his own words. Meanwhile, the forensic lab processed the car found in the forest clearing. Inside, traces of gunpowder matched the kitchen samples. Blood spatter under the driver's seat came back as Sandra's. The duffel bag contained a folded document, the revised insurance policy, and an envelope labeled "Starting Fresh." Inside it, $5,000 in cash. It wasn't just a getaway plan. It was a declaration that his new life would begin the moment hers ended. Ramirez couldn't shake the detail that haunted him most, the soccer medal. It sat on the passenger seat, half-coated in dust, its ribbon twisted as though clenched by a shaking hand. The detective held it in an evidence bag and said quietly, "He brought a trophy to his mother's funeral." While the physical evidence stacked higher, Aaron's behavior in custody stayed unchanged. During one interview, a junior officer accidentally left a case file on the table. Aaron opened it, read the first page, and laughed. "You really think this makes me evil?" he said. "It's called survival." That clip later leaked online. Within hours, social media was flooded with outrage. People couldn't fathom the arrogance. Comment sections filled with fury. "He's a monster. Where's his remorse? Give him life." But some responses, chillingly, called him brilliant. Ramirez read those comments late one night and muttered, "This is what he wanted. Attention." The investigation dug deeper. The second fingerprint found in Aaron's duffel bag finally came back from analysis. It belonged to Trevor, his closest friend. When confronted, Trevor broke down immediately. He told me he was running away, he confessed. I thought he meant for a few days, not forever. Trevor explained that Aaron had asked him to hold on to the duffel bag for one night, claiming it was just stuff his mom didn't want him to have. He had no idea it contained a weapon. The next morning, Aaron picked it up, thanked him, and said, "Next time you see me, I'll be famous." Prosecutors now had the final link tying motive, method, and manipulation. Trevor would testify later that Aaron seemed almost excited when talking about starting over. He described a kind of pride, not panic, as though Aaron believed murder was a step toward self-creation. At this stage, every officer in Willow Ridge wanted one thing: to see the smirk vanish. But Ramirez warned them, "Don't expect remorse. Kids like this don't break. They perform." And perform he did. During a brief pre-trial hearing, when asked if he understood the charges, Aaron looked straight at the judge and said, "Yeah, murder. Big word, huh?" The courtroom gasped. The judge's gavel struck hard. "This is not a game, Mr. Mills." He grinned. "Sure feels like one." That was the moment Judge Helena Whitman decided. No leniency, no excuses. This boy would face trial as an adult. Back at the station, Ramirez filed the last of the evidence reports. He stared at the photos one final time, the smiling family, the broken kettle, the duffel bag packed for escape, and whispered, "You thought you were smarter than everyone, kid, but you forgot one thing." He closed the file in a muttered, "The truth always leaves fingerprints." The next chapter of the case would play out not in evidence rooms or forensic labs, but in front of cameras, jurors, and the world. The boy who mocked death would now face justice. And this time, the smirk might not survive the sentence. Aaron Mills spent his first nights in juvenile detention like a celebrity in exile. While other inmates avoided the cameras and kept their heads down, he seemed to lean toward the lens. Every time an officer walked by, he'd lift his chin slightly, as if daring the world to watch. He wasn't just unafraid, he was entertained. When psychologists arrived for the mandatory evaluation, they expected confusion or denial. Instead, they found control. Aaron answered every question with unsettling precision, his voice calm, his gaze steady. When asked if he regretted what happened, he smiled and said, "Regret is for people who lose." It was the kind of line that could only come from someone who believed life was a contest, and he was still winning. The evaluation report labeled him high-functioning with antisocial traits. He showed an absence of empathy, inflated self-perception, and manipulative tendencies. In plain terms, he was a teenager who saw human beings as obstacles. The examiner noted one final line in her report: displays enjoyment when discussing crime. News outlets devoured those words. The headline, "Teen Killer Shows No Remorse," dominated morning television. The footage of Aaron smirking during his first court appearance went viral. Commentators called him a sociopath. Social media dubbed him the grinning killer. The more people hated him, the more he seemed to glow under their disgust. Detective Ramirez visited him once more before the trial. "You know," he said, setting the file on the table, "every arrogant kid I've ever met thought they were smarter than the system. None of them ever walked free." Aaron leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "Then maybe I'll be your first." "You won't," Ramirez said quietly. "You're too proud to lie well." Aaron tilted his head. "You sound almost disappointed." "Disappointed?" Ramirez said. "No. Angry that a woman like your mother raised you with love, and this is how you paid her back." Aaron smirked again, a flash of teeth like mock applause. "She shouldn't have tried to control me." The detective stood up slowly. "She tried to save you." Aaron shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "Then she failed." That sentence followed Ramirez out of the room, echoing down the hallway like a curse. As the pre-trial motions continued, Psychologists and lawyers debated whether Aaron should be tried as a juvenile or an adult. The defense argued that his brain was still developing, that impulse and immaturity had guided him more than intent. But the prosecution had the messages, the maps, the money, the fingerprint, each one a piece of premeditation. In court filings, the prosecutor wrote, "This was not the act of an impulsive teenager. This was a calculated execution." Judge Helena Whitman agreed. She ruled he would stand trial as an adult, citing the depth of planning and total lack of remorse. The courtroom murmured. Aaron smiled wider. Meanwhile, the Mills family fractured under the weight of grief and betrayal. Sandra's husband, Dylan, could barely step inside the courtroom. He sat in the back row during hearings, hands clasped so tightly they trembled. Lily, now under her aunt's care, refused to look at her brother on the news. "He's not my brother," she whispered once. "He's someone else wearing his face." The town of Willow Ridge changed too. People locked their doors earlier, eyes darting toward Maple Street whenever they passed. Parents told their children that evil didn't always come from strangers. It could come from within your own home. Aaron's time in custody remained unchanged. He joked with guards, scribbled rap lyrics about freedom, and bragged to other inmates about how famous he was. When asked by one of them if he feared the verdict, Aaron grinned. "Judges love stories," he said. "I'll give her one," but Judge Whitman wasn't a woman who enjoyed stories. She was known for her patience, her unflinching calm, and her belief that accountability was sacred. When she watched the interrogation tapes, she didn't see a misguided child. She saw a predator in training. The court date was set. State of North Carolina versus Aaron Mills. The trial would be open to the public. Cameras, reporters, and spectators would fill every bench. Before it began, Ramirez was asked by a journalist what he hoped for. He paused before answering. "I just want to see the moment he realizes he's not in control anymore," he said. "That's the only time people like him understand truth." And that moment was coming. The courtroom lights would burn brighter than his smirk, the silence would weigh heavier than his arrogance, and for the first time, Aaron Mills would face someone he couldn't outsmart, a judge who believed justice was not a performance. The day of the trial would not just decide his fate. It would decide whether evil that wears a teenager's face could ever claim innocence again. Next came the courtroom theater, where every smirk would be met by the sound of a gavel, and every word he mocked would turn into a sentence he couldn't escape. The courthouse in Willow Ridge had never seen a crowd like this. Reporters filled the steps before dawn, their cameras glinting under a gray sky. The headline had turned into a national fixation: "The teen who mocked the judge." Every spectator wanted to witness whether arrogance could survive justice. Inside, the courtroom felt colder than usual, wooden benches lined with anxious faces, whispers fluttering like wind before a storm. Sandra's family sat together in the front row, Lily holding her aunt's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Across from them sat Aaron Mills, 17 years old, dressed in the standard orange jumpsuit, eyes bright, lips curled into that familiar smirk. Judge Helena Whitman entered the room, her robe crisp, her expression unreadable. The murmur died instantly. Aaron didn't stand until his lawyer nudged him, and even then he rolled his eyes. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of mockery. The bailiff's voice echoed, "All rise." When everyone was seated again, the judge began. "This court convenes today for the trial of Aaron Mills, charged with first-degree murder in the death of Sandra Mills. The court expects decorum. There will be no theatrics." Aaron tilted his head, feigning boredom. To him, this was theater. The prosecution opened first. District Attorney Evelyn Clark stood tall, her tone controlled, but edged with fury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "you will hear of a mother who devoted her life to her children, and you will see the face of the boy who calculated her death for money and freedom." She walked toward the defense table, eyes fixed on Aaron. You'll hear his words, his searches, his laughter in interrogation. You'll see his arrogance in this courtroom. He believes youth is immunity. But justice does not bow to age, and it does not smile back. A ripple of quiet anger moved through the gallery. When the defense attorney rose, he looked almost apologetic. "My client," he said softly, "is a child, a confused young man raised under pressure who made a tragic mistake." He gestured toward Aaron. "He is not a monster. He is a product of circumstance." Aaron smirked at that. It wasn't the smirk of nervousness or embarrassment. It was pride. He seemed to enjoy the sound of his own defense, like a spectator at his own trial. Judge Whitman noticed. "Mr. Mills," she said sharply, "wipe that expression off your face. You are standing trial for the murder of your mother." Aaron looked straight at her, his voice carrying across the courtroom. "I'm just listening, Your Honor. Didn't know smiling was illegal." Gasps filled the room. The judge's gavel struck the bench once, hard. "This court will not tolerate disrespect." Sandra's sister covered her face, tears slipping through her fingers. Lily looked down, trembling. Dylan Mills, their father, stared at his son as though trying to recognize him and failing. The first witness took the stand, Sergeant Ramirez. His voice was steady as he described the morning of the arrest, the evidence trail, the fingerprint on the kettle, the gun, the duffel bag, the cash. "We have no doubt this was premeditated," he said. "He planned every step." When the prosecutor asked him to describe Aaron's behavior after arrest, Ramirez hesitated. "He smiled," he said finally, "like he was proud." That single line silenced the room. Next came the coroner's report. Photos were shown to the jury, sanitized, clinical, yet heavy with the weight of betrayal. The prosecutor's voice cracked slightly when she said, "This was a mother making coffee for her son." The defense objected, calling the images prejudicial. Judge Whitman overruled. "The truth is not prejudicial, counsel. It is necessary." Throughout it all, Aaron sat still, expression barely shifting. But when the prosecution mentioned his online alias, Ghost23, his jaw tightened. The courtroom caught it, the first fracture in his facade. "Mr. Mills," the prosecutor said, turning toward him, "did you or did you not create a second account to encourage yourself to commit this crime?" His lawyer rose. "Objection, Your Honor. He is not testifying today." "Sustained," the judge said. But her eyes never left Aaron. He leaned back, smirking again, whispering something to his attorney. The prosecutor noticed. "Would you like to share that with the court?" she asked. Aaron spoke up without hesitation. "I said, they really think they've got me." The judge's gavel slammed again. "Enough." The gallery buzzed like static. The arrogance wasn't imagined. It was on display, alive, and burning. At recess, reporters swarmed the hallway. Every headline twisted sharper. "Teen killer laughs in court," the smirk that shook the jury. Inside her chambers, Judge Whitman sat in silence, reviewing the evidence photographs. Her clerk asked, "How can someone that young be that cold?" The judge didn't look up. "Because he thinks the world has no weight." "My job," she said softly, "is to remind him it does." Back in the courtroom, the day closed with one final exchange. The judge addressed Aaron directly. "Do you understand the charges against you?" He grinned, eyes glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Yeah." "Murder. First degree. Sounds serious." Judge Whitman's voice dropped low and sharp. "You're right. It's the most serious thing you will ever face." As the gavel struck to adjourn for the day, Aaron chuckled under his breath. The sound echoed in the silence, cruel and hollow. But the trial was only beginning, and every smirk, every word, every ounce of arrogance would soon become evidence of its own. The boy who mocked justice was about to learn that the courtroom doesn't forget. By the second week of the trial, the courtroom had transformed into a theater of proof. Every seat was filled. Reporters packed shoulder to shoulder, microphones lined the hallway, and the buzz of anticipation clung to the air. Everyone wanted to see if the mountain of evidence could finally crush the smirk that had haunted every headline. District Attorney Evelyn Clark began with the gun. She lifted it from its clear evidence box with gloved hands and held it steady before the jury. "This weapon," she said, her voice calm but razor-sharp, "was found in the defendant's duffel bag, alongside a silencer, cash, and the policy that made him his mother's sole beneficiary." She let the silence linger. "Every piece of this tells you what he planned, and why." A forensic specialist took the stand next, walking the jury through a detailed timeline. The bullet casing recovered from the kitchen matched the gun perfectly. Gunshot residue on Aaron's jacket linked him to the scene. The fingerprint on the kettle, half smeared but irrefutable, matched his right index finger. No other prints of similar clarity were found, the expert said. This one was deliberate, not accidental. He held the handle after firing. Aaron watched, expression unreadable. When the jurors glanced toward him, he met their eyes one by one, almost daring them to look away. It was as if he still believed that charm, or arrogance, could save him. The prosecutor moved to digital evidence. Screens illuminated the courtroom as Aaron's laptop activity appeared for the jury. Searches for suppressors, fingerprint removal, and insurance loopholes. The timestamps marched toward the hour of the murder like a countdown clock. Clark turned to the jury. "This wasn't an accident, it was a blueprint." Defense counsel tried to soften the impact. "Curiosity is not conspiracy," he argued. "Teenagers Google foolish things. We don't convict them for it." But the prosecutor was ready. She played a short video of Aaron's interrogation where he leaned back, smiled, and said, "Guess I left a souvenir." The words hung in the air like a confession. The jury shifted uneasily. Reporters scribbled furiously. The smirk that once looked cocky now seemed grotesque. Next came the messages, the text chains between Aaron and Ghost 23. Clark paced slowly before the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you will hear that the defendant created a second online identity, one that encouraged him to commit the act. These are his words to himself." She read aloud. "Freedom comes after the noise stops." Another, "She'll never see it coming." A hush fell. Even the defense lowered its gaze. Then came the witnesses, teachers, classmates, friends. One by one they painted the same picture. Aaron, the charming boy who had grown colder, crueler, more self-assured. His coach testified that he'd once overheard Aaron tell a teammate, "Rules are for people who need them." A small comment back then, but now it sounded like prophecy. Sandra's husband, Dylan, took the stand last that day. He spoke with a voice that trembled but never broke. "She loved him more than anyone," he said, staring down at his hands. "She forgave him when he lied, defended him when the neighbors complained, and told me he was just lost. She thought love could fix anything." He paused, swallowing hard. She didn't know he saw that love as weakness. Lily watched from the front row, tears streaming silently. She was too young to testify, but her presence said more than words ever could. The defense tried to counter with an angle of manipulation. They produced a psychiatrist who claimed Aaron suffered from reactive narcissistic personality traits amplified by adolescent impulsivity. It was a clinical way of saying he was young and misguided, but it failed to explain the precision, the lists, the timing, the calmness of execution. When the prosecutor cross-examined, she asked, "Doctor, if this young man were truly impulsive, would he have created an alternate persona to encourage himself? Would he have researched life insurance payouts 2 weeks before the act?" The doctor hesitated, then sighed. "No, that indicates planning." The jury saw it. Everyone did. As the day closed, Judge Whitman addressed the room. This court reminds both counsels that evidence, not emotion, determines guilt. But I caution the defendant to remember, arrogance is not innocence. Aaron's smirk flickered then for the first time. Just for a heartbeat, the mask slipped. But when the bailiff led him away, he smiled again for the cameras. That defiance reignited the fury of everyone who'd sat through the day's testimony. Outside, the headlines grew sharper, the smirk that won't die, a son on trial for his mother's love and life. Inside the courthouse, however, the jury wasn't swayed by outrage. They were focused. Every fact, every photo, every timestamp pulled them closer to one conclusion. And as the prosecution prepared to unveil its final pieces of evidence, the surveillance footage and the insurance transfer logs, the balance of the trial shifted. Judge Whitman's gavel echoed once across the courtroom. "We reconvene tomorrow." Aaron looked up, still smiling. But his lawyer saw something in his eyes, something small, sharp, and new. For the first time, fear. The morning of the last trial day dawned heavy and gray, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Outside the courthouse, a sea of cameras waited. Reporters murmured about what the prosecution had promised, irrefutable, final proof. Inside, the air felt dense. The spectators who had come for spectacle were now quiet, subdued. No one smiled anymore. When Aaron entered, that trademark grin still lingered, but thinner now, more forced. He glanced toward the front row where Lily sat between her aunt and father. She didn't look back. The gulf between them had become wider than the room itself. Judge Whitman took her seat, and the sound of the gavel stilled every whisper. "Proceed," she said. District Attorney Clark rose and spoke with the calm precision of someone carrying the truth like a blade. "The prosecution calls its final witnesses," she said, "and presents the final piece of this story." A forensic accountant stepped up first. 2 weeks before Sandra Mills' death, he explained, the defendant requested to be added as beneficiary to his mother's life insurance policy. The change was approved. 3 days later, he searched the payout terms. He paused and looked directly at the jury. This was not an accident. It was premeditated financial intent. Next, Clark revealed a series of digital transfers. On Aaron's laptop, files showed drafts of fake job applications and messages to rental listings in other cities. The timestamps? Dated 2 days after the murder. Plans already in motion. She turned toward the jury. He didn't just plan her death. He planned his new life. The defense tried to counter with emotion. He was confused, pressured. He didn't understand the weight of what he was doing. Clark didn't blink. He understood perfectly because he calculated every penny. Then came the final blow. The prosecution rolled a surveillance video from a neighbor's security camera. The timestamp, 10:58 a.m., 1 minute after the fatal gunshot. The grainy footage showed Aaron leaving the house, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, hood pulled up. He paused, turned toward the camera, and smiled. That smile froze the courtroom. The gallery gasped. Even the judge's expression darkened. Clark let the silence linger before she spoke. "He smiled at the camera," she said softly, "because he thought he'd gotten away with it." For the first time in the entire trial, Aaron's composure cracked. His jaw tightened. His foot tapped against the floor, restless. The smirk vanished. The prosecutor walked to the center of the courtroom and lifted the photo of Sandra Mills, the same one taken months before the murder. Her eyes were warm, gentle, alive. "This woman loved her son," Clark said. "She worked 2 jobs, so he could play soccer, so he could go to college, so he could have a future. And in return, he gave her death. For money, for pride, for nothing." She turned to Aaron. "Look at her, Mr. Mills. Look at what you destroyed." Aaron looked up but didn't meet the photo. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, but he jerked it away. When the prosecution rested, the courtroom was silent. The defense, realizing the damage, chose not to call Aaron to the stand. "We won't risk it," his attorney whispered. The boy's arrogance had already spoken louder than any testimony could. Judge Whitman dismissed the jury for deliberation. The doors closed, leaving the courtroom heavy with stillness. Hours passed. Outside, rain began to fall. In the waiting room, Lily sat beside her father, clutching her mother's necklace in her fist. "Do you think he'll ever understand what he did?" she asked. Dylan's answer was barely a whisper. "He doesn't have the heart to." When the jury finally returned, the foreman stood. The judge's voice cut through the rain tapping against the windows. "Have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," she nodded. "Please state it." The foreman's hands trembled slightly as he read, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Aaron Mills, guilty of murder in the first degree." A wave of breath moved through the courtroom. Sandra's family wept. Reporters scribbled furiously. Aaron sat still, staring at nothing. Then the judge asked, "Mr. Mills, do you have anything you wish to say before sentencing?" Aaron turned toward the gallery, his voice sharp, brittle. "You all wanted a monster, so here I am." He smirked. But this time, it was hollow, a reflex with no power. Judge Whitman didn't flinch. "No, Mr. Mills," she said quietly, "you made yourself a monster. The rest of us just watched." The gavel struck once. "Sentencing will be announced tomorrow." As guards led him away, his shoulders seemed smaller, the smirk barely clinging to his face. For the first time it looked less like arrogance and more like fear pretending to be pride. That night, headlines lit up again. Verdict delivered. Teen killer found guilty. But the real story was quieter. A father crying in the courthouse hallway, a sister clutching a necklace, and a boy finally realizing that freedom was gone forever. Tomorrow, Judge Helena Whitman would deliver his sentence. And this time, no smirk would survive the sound of the gavel. The final day of the trial began in eerie silence. There were no camera flashes this time, no murmuring crowd pressing against the courtroom doors. The spectacle was over. Only justice remained. A gray light slanted through the high windows as the bailiff called the room to order. Judge Helena Whitman entered with slow, deliberate steps. Her face was composed but heavy with the burden of what she was about to pronounce. Before her sat the boy who had become a national symbol of arrogance and cruelty, Aaron Mills, 17, found guilty of murdering his mother. He looked smaller now, his shoulders hunched, his smirk faded to a faint twitch. But his eyes, still defiant, searched the room for someone to meet them. Sandra's family sat in the front row. Dylan Mills, hollow-eyed, gripped a folded tissue but never used it. Beside him, Lily clutched their mother's necklace again, as if holding it could make her brave. "Mr. Mills," the judge began, her tone even but resonant, "before I deliver this court sentence, you are permitted to speak." Aaron leaned toward the microphone. His voice came out calm, flat, stripped of emotion. "I did what I had to do," he said. "You can say what you want. It doesn't change anything." The words hit the room like a blow. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Even the guards tensed. Judge Whitman's eyes hardened. "What it changes," she said, "is everything." She turned toward the jury box, now empty but symbolic of the people's voice. "This case has been a lesson in betrayal, a mother who gave her life to a son who decided it wasn't enough. He planned her death, executed it without hesitation, and has yet to show an ounce of remorse." Her voice deepened, carrying the weight of the verdict through every corner of the room. "We do not measure justice by age, Mr. Mills. We measure it by humanity, and you have shown none." Aaron stared straight ahead, expressionless. The judge continued, each word deliberate. "The court therefore sentences you, Aaron Mills, to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." The words echoed like thunder. For a moment, time froze. The smirk that had haunted this case, the one that sneered through interrogations and trials, that taunted the public, vanished. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His head dropped slightly, not in sorrow, but in disbelief. The boy who once believed he could outwit the world had just learned that arrogance had limits. Lily began to cry softly, the sound barely audible but piercing. Dylan wrapped his arm around her. Across the aisle, a woman whispered, "Finally." Judge Whitman looked directly at Aaron once more. "Your mother believed in your potential," she said. "She thought you were worth saving. But today, this court declares that her love was greater than your humanity. She gave you life, and you took hers. And so you will spend yours behind bars." Aaron blinked, his jaw tightening. For a heartbeat it seemed he might speak again, to argue, to protest, to laugh. But he didn't. He just sat there, eyes unfocused, as the gavel came down. "Court is adjourned." The sound was final. As guards took him by the arms, Aaron resisted just long enough to look back at the rows of faces staring at him. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras caught his every move, but for the first time, his expression wasn't arrogance. It was confusion, the dawning realization that this was forever. Outside, the sky broke open with rain. The crowd that had waited for weeks for justice stood under umbrellas as the news spread. Life without parole. Inside the courthouse, Lily stood and approached the bench. Her voice was soft, trembling, but sure. "Thank you, Your Honor." Judge Whitman nodded. "Your mother would be proud of your strength." Down the hall, as Aaron was led away in handcuffs, a journalist asked, "Do you have any regrets, Aaron?" He turned his head slightly, rain streaking across the glass door. For a moment he almost smiled again, but it wasn't defiance this time. It was something hollow, something defeated. "No," he said quietly, "it doesn't matter now." And just like that, he was gone, swallowed by the system he thought he could beat. The courtroom emptied slowly. Reporters packed up their gear, the family gathered their strength, and Judge Whitman sat alone for a moment longer. She stared down at her notes, the photos, the evidence, the mother's name, and whispered, "Justice served." Outside, the courthouse steps glistened with rain. The echo of the gavel still hung in the air, mingled with the sound of distant thunder. For the first time in months, Willow Ridge exhaled. The smirk that once mocked the law had finally disappeared, wiped clean by the weight of consequence. When the sentence was read, Willow Ridge seemed to stop breathing. The quiet little town that had once celebrated its high school soccer star now whispered his name like a curse. By the time Aaron was taken from the courthouse, every local station had broken the story. 17-year-old sentenced to life without parole. For most, it was justice. For others, it was heartbreak. At the Mills house on Maple Street, yellow tape still fluttered in the wind. The front door was locked, the windows covered with white sheets. Once the warm center of the neighborhood, it now stood like a museum of absence. Sandra's flowers had wilted, and the mailbox overflowed with letters of condolence, some from strangers, others from her students. Each one began the same way. She didn't deserve this. Inside, Dylan Mills couldn't bear to touch anything. He sat in the living room night after night, staring at the couch where his wife used to read, at the bookshelf she kept alphabetized, at the family photos that no longer looked like memories but warnings. He couldn't bring himself to take Aaron's picture down, even though every time he saw it, he felt something break again. Lily tried to return to school. She walked through the halls that still whispered her brother's name. Some kids avoided her, others tried to comfort her with awkward sympathy. In her backpack she carried Sandra's old library mug, the one that read, "Best Mom Ever." She didn't drink from it. It was just something to hold on to, proof that love had existed once. The community gathered a week later at the high school gym for a memorial. Hundreds attended. Teachers, students, parents, neighbors, A candle for Sandra burned at the center of the stage. Principal Hayes spoke first. Sandra believed in knowledge, he said, voice cracking. She believed that books could save anyone. She never stopped believing that, even when her own son fell apart. Lily stepped forward then, small but unshaken. "My mom always said people aren't born bad," she said softly. "They just forget how to be good." The gym was silent. Even the reporters put their pens down. That night the whole town lit candles on their porches. The glow stretched down every street, tiny stars against the dark. It wasn't just grief, it was defiance. Willow Ridge refused to let one boy's cruelty define them. But the aftermath had shadows too. Some whispered about what went wrong. Was it parenting, pressure, or something darker that no one could see? Others wondered how a teenager could carry such hate without anyone noticing. The debate filled talk shows and editorials. Parents across the county started checking in on their kids more, asking quiet questions at dinner tables. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" At the local high school field, the soccer team held a ceremony to retire Aaron's jersey. The number 17 hung for a moment in the wind, before they lowered it and packed it away. His teammates said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Detective Ramirez visited Dylan a month after the sentencing. He found him sitting on the porch, staring at the rain. "Justice doesn't fix it," Dylan said quietly. "It just stops it from spreading." Ramirez nodded. "Sometimes that's all we get." The detective handed him a small envelope, Sandra's wedding ring. It had been held as evidence, now returned. Dylan turned it in his palm, the gold still faintly warm from touch. "She forgave everyone," he said. "Even him, I think." "Maybe that's why she was the best of us," Ramirez replied. Life in Willow Ridge moved on in cautious steps. The library reopened, and the town council renamed the children's reading section the Sandra Mills Corner. A plaque read, "For the woman who believed stories could save us." Lily began visiting every week, shelving books and helping younger kids find their favorites. She told them, "My mom would have liked this one." And every child who listened learned her name. Still, at night, the house on Maple Street stood silent, a scar on the neighborhood. The wind sometimes knocked a shutter loose, and the sound echoed like footsteps in an empty hall. Those who passed by said they could almost hear the faint whistle of a kettle from inside, a reminder of the moment innocence ended. The tragedy that started with arrogance had become a warning carved into the town's heart. Even love can't save someone who refuses to be saved. But in quiet ways, Sandra's legacy lived on. Through her students, through the books she left behind, through a daughter who refused to forget that kindness could still exist, even after darkness had tried to erase it. Willow Ridge would never be the same, but it would never stop trying to be good again. And in a cell hundreds of miles away, the boy who once smirked at the world sat alone, staring at a wall where there were no cameras left to admire him. Months passed, and yet the story of Aaron Mills refused to fade. It lingered on talk shows, in classrooms, in dinner table debates. People couldn't stop asking the same question: can someone so young be beyond redemption? Judge Helena Whitman became an unexpected public figure. Her firm yet measured sentencing was dissected on national television. Some praised her as a symbol of moral clarity. Others questioned the ethics of condemning a teenager to life without parole. When asked about it in an interview, she answered simply, "Justice doesn't measure by birthdays. It measures by choices." Psychologists and criminologists began studying the case. One wrote in a journal that Aaron's crime was a convergence of entitlement and detachment, the kind of moral void that social media sometimes disguised as confidence. Another expert noted that his behavior wasn't sudden. "He rehearsed arrogance for years," she said. "By the time he killed his mother, empathy was already gone." Across the country, The case sparked conversations about parental pressure and youth mental health. Some argued Sandra had been too strict, others that she'd been too lenient. Everyone searched for an explanation that could make sense of the senseless. But no theory could bridge the chasm between a mother's love and her son's act of betrayal. In Willow Ridge, the community tried to heal by changing how it looked at its own children. The high school introduced weekly counseling sessions and peer mentorship programs. The principal told students, "We can't undo what happened here, but we can listen sooner, notice more, and never assume silence means peace." Teachers watched for the quiet ones, the angry ones, the ones who seemed too sure they didn't need help. Lily became a voice for that change. She started speaking at assemblies, her words steady but soft. "My brother thought he could live without love, but love is what makes us human." Her classmates listened, many for the first time without glancing at their phones. When she finished, there was always silence, the kind that meant understanding, not pity. Meanwhile, Aaron's life shrank to a 6-by-8-foot cell. He spent his days in the same monotony: roll call, meals, silence. The letters that arrived for him weren't from admirers anymore, but from journalists, criminology students, or strangers demanding answers. He rarely replied. When he did, the handwriting was neat, the tone eerily detached. In one letter he wrote, "They want remorse. I don't have it to give." In another he wrote, "The world cares more about my smile than about what made it." The prison psychologist noted his words but saw something new, a faint hesitation, an edge of exhaustion. Arrogance has a half-life. Without attention, it fades. Without audience, it withers. And in that silence, sometimes reflection begins. Outside the prison walls, debates about his sentence grew louder. Advocacy groups for juvenile reform claimed he was a symptom of neglect and social decay. Victims' advocates countered, saying his punishment was the only language accountability could speak. The divide reflected the same question echoing through America's courts. At what age does evil stop being forgivable? Judge Whitman was asked that question during a panel at a law symposium months later. She paused before answering. "When a young man can plan a murder, execute it, mock his victim, and laugh at justice," she said, "he is old enough to know better." The audience applauded quietly, not out of admiration, but understanding. Back in Willow Ridge, a quiet memorial garden was planted near the library. A small plaque bore Sandra's favorite quote from her journals: "Kindness is not weakness. It's courage that remembers." On weekends, Lily watered the flowers herself, whispering stories about her life to the air. And every so often, someone walking past would stop and remember the lesson Sandra Mills had taught them all, that monsters aren't always born. Sometimes they are made by ego, by pride, by a world that mistakes defiance for strength. The question of mercy would follow the case for years, but in Willow Ridge the answer was simpler. Mercy belonged to the woman who offered love until her last breath. Justice belonged to the gavel that finally silenced the smile that mocked her. In the end, the tragedy of Aaron Mills became less about one boy's crime and more about what it revealed: the thin line between confidence and cruelty, between a promise and a threat, between youth and moral adulthood. And though the story had reached its legal conclusion, emotionally it was far from over. Because behind every courtroom verdict lies the echo of one question: what does justice mean when love was the first to die? That question would carry into the next chapter, where the consequences of arrogance continued to ripple far beyond the prison walls. The appeal was filed quietly, almost without notice. 6 months after sentencing, Aaron Mills' defense team submitted a motion claiming the punishment was disproportionate to the offender's developmental maturity. The legal phrasing was sterile, detached, but to the families it reopened wounds that had only just begun to scar. Judge Helena Whitman had warned this might happen. Still, when the notice came across her desk, she closed her eyes for a long moment. "He's still playing," she murmured, "still trying to win the last hand." The appeal hearing drew far less media attention than the trial. The frenzy had faded, replaced by fatigue. The public already knew what they believed. Yet inside the courtroom, the tension returned, sharp as ever. Dylan Mills and Lily attended by video link from their aunt's home. Their faces were older, somehow, worn by grief, but steadier. Aaron appeared via live feed from the correctional facility, dressed in gray prison uniform instead of orange. The once cocky grin was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped stillness. But his eyes, that same flicker of defiance, hadn't dimmed entirely. The defense attorney spoke first, voice polished but hollow. "Your Honors, we contend that Mr. Mills' life sentence fails to account for his age, neurological development, and capacity for rehabilitation. He was 17, a child in the eyes of the law. We ask that his sentence be reduced or reconsidered." The lead prosecutor from the original case, Evelyn Clark, stood next. Her tone carried the calm of absolute conviction. With respect, the defense misrepresents what this case has already made clear. Mr. Mills was not guided by immaturity. He was guided by greed, calculation, and the cold absence of empathy. Age did not hinder him. He used it as a shield. She paused, letting the silence breathe. This was not a mistake. It was a decision. The presiding appellate judge leaned forward. "Does the defendant have anything to add before we rule?" Aaron adjusted the microphone. "Yeah," he said. His voice was quieter than before, but his words still carried that edge. "Everyone's been talking about me like I'm evil or broken. But you never think about how boring life gets when you realize nothing matters." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. One of the judges frowned. "Do you believe your actions had no consequence?" Aaron gave a short, humorless laugh. "They had consequences. I'm here, aren't I?" The prosecutor looked at him for a long moment, not with anger anymore, but something closer to pity. After deliberation, the appellate court returned with its decision. The sentence would stand. The lead judge's ruling was firm. The nature of the crime, its premeditation, and the defendant's persistent lack of remorse affirmed the original judgment. The appeal is denied. The gavel fell once. Aaron blinked slowly, as if the sound surprised him. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, but he didn't react. "Same ending," he muttered. From their video feed, Lily stared at the monitor. She expected to feel triumph or relief. Instead, she felt empty, the kind of exhaustion that comes when victory changes nothing. When reporters later asked how she felt, she said only, "It doesn't bring her back, but it stops him from hurting anyone else." That night, a local station aired a short segment on the ruling. The anchor's voice was measured, the story brief. It wasn't national news anymore, just another tragic case, fading into archives. But in Willow Ridge, the story still carried weight. At the library memorial, fresh flowers appeared under Sandra's plaque. No note, just color against the gray stone. Inside the prison, Aaron returned to his cell. His roommate said he sat on the bunk for hours, staring at the wall. Later that evening, during the head count, he asked a guard, "Do you ever think people can start over?" The guard replied, "Not from that far back." Aaron didn't answer. He just lay back, eyes open, as the lights dimmed. Outside, the world moved on. But the case left echoes. In classrooms where teachers now spoke about empathy as much as academics, in courtrooms where prosecutors referenced the Mills precedent when arguing for trying juveniles as adults, and in homes where parents hugged their children a little tighter. For the first time since the trial, Judge Whitman slept without waking in the middle of the night. She had done her duty, and though justice couldn't heal the wound, it had stopped the bleeding. Lily visited the memorial garden the next day. The spring air was soft, the flowers in bloom. She placed a new photo beside the plaque, her mother smiling at the library desk, and whispered, "It's over now, Mom." But as she turned to leave, a question stayed in her heart, one she'd never say aloud. If Aaron ever asked for forgiveness, would I give it? The wind stirred through the garden, bending the flowers gently. Somewhere, it almost sounded like her mother's voice, whispering, "Forgiveness is not freedom. It's peace." The world had judged Aaron Mills, but for those who lived through his darkness, forgiveness was the final trial, one that might take a lifetime to reach. And as the years began to turn, the story of the smirking teen killer would transform again, no longer just a case file, but a lesson etched into the conscience of a community. That justice can punish, but only empathy can heal. The years that followed didn't erase the pain, but they reshaped it into something different, something quieter, steadier, almost redemptive. The story of Sandra and Aaron Mills became less about the crime itself and more about what it left behind. In Willow Ridge, people stopped saying the murder and started saying the lesson. It began with a scholarship. Dylan Mills launched it 1 year after the sentencing, the Sandra Mills Memorial Grant, awarded to students who wanted to become teachers or librarians. He said it was a way to keep her voice alive in classrooms she never got to see. The first recipient was a shy senior who had once been one of Sandra's library helpers. When she accepted, she said softly, "She taught me how to believe in stories again." At the Willow Ridge Library, a small wing was built in Sandra's honor. A brass plaque read, "For the woman who believed knowledge could save anyone, even when it couldn't save her." The corner filled quickly with donated books, hand-me-down novels, and children's fairy tales marked with her name on the inside cover. Parents brought their kids there on weekends, telling them not just about Sandra's kindness, but about what happens when love is taken for granted. Lily grew into her mother's reflection. She went on to study library science, determined to build the life her mother had dreamed for both of them. In interviews, she spoke about the danger of silence, the warning signs people ignore. "We talk about monsters like they're born that way," she said, "but arrogance, cruelty, selfishness, they grow, and if no one challenges them, they consume everything." Her words spread far beyond her small town. She began working with advocacy programs for youth mental health, focusing on intervention before a crisis. Her message was simple: see them before they disappear into themselves. The first time she spoke at a national conference, she closed with her mother's favorite line, "Kindness isn't weakness, it's courage that remembers." The crowd stood in silence, then applause. The Mills case became a fixture in university ethics and criminology courses. Professors dissected it as an example of the fine line between adolescence and accountability. Some saw Aaron as a cautionary tale about entitlement. Others saw him as proof that evil can exist in its purest form, even behind a young face. Legal scholars debated whether juveniles should ever be sentenced to life without parole. But no amount of academic debate could undo what had happened on Maple Street. In the prison where Aaron served his sentence, his reputation faded. The guards stopped calling him the smirking kid. Inmates stopped testing him once they realized he wasn't defiant anymore, just empty. He spent his days working in the laundry, his nights reading books from the prison library. Ironically, the librarian there was a woman who had once followed his mother's reading recommendations. She didn't recognize his name at first. When she did, she said nothing. She just slid books across the counter, books his mother had loved. He read them all. To Kill a Mockingbird, Les Miserables, The Diary of Anne Frank. Sometimes he would stop at underlined passages in the margins, lines that echoed compassion. He never told anyone, but he started keeping a notebook. Guards who passed by his cell said he was always writing, never letters, never journal entries, just sentences that never seemed to connect. Years later, a prison counselor found one of those notebooks left behind in the library. Inside, on the first page, Aaron had written, "If you destroy love long enough, the silence starts to sound like forgiveness." It wasn't redemption, but it was something, an acknowledgement, a whisper of understanding too late to matter. Back in Willow Ridge, Lily visited her mother's memorial garden every spring. She'd sit with a cup of coffee watching children run past the library windows. Sometimes she imagined her mother there, sorting books, laughing softly, alive in every ordinary moment. The town, too, carried her legacy forward. Every year on the anniversary of Sandra's death, Willow Ridge hosted a Day of Light, encouraging families to spend the day together. No phones, no distractions, just connection. They called it Sandra's Day. One year, a reporter asked Lily what she hoped people remembered about her brother. She hesitated, then answered, "I hope they remember that he had a choice, because that's the part that matters. The choice." Her words rippled across social media, quoted in headlines, studied by students who had never heard of the case before. The story found new life not as tragedy, but as truth, a warning about pride, neglect, and the fragile architecture of family. By the 10th anniversary, the smirk that once defined Aaron Mills was no longer part of the story. What endured instead was the image of a mother who believed too much in goodness, and a daughter who carried that belief forward. And at the library that day, a child tugged at Lily's sleeve and asked, "Was your mom a hero?" Lily smiled. "She was just someone who never stopped trying to make people better." The little girl thought for a moment, then nodded. "That sounds like a hero to me." As evening fell, the wind stirred through the garden, brushing the flowers beneath Sandra's plaque. The sun dipped low, painting the sky gold. And for the first time in a long time, the story of Sandra and Aaron Mills felt less like a tragedy and more like a memory finally at peace. But before the curtain could close completely, one final moment still remained, the memory of the gavel, the echo of the verdict, and the lasting truth that justice, once spoken, never fully fades. That truth would find its final voice in the last chapter, the moment when arrogance met its end and poetic justice sealed the story forever. The courtroom that had once burned with noise was now just a room of echoes. The old wooden benches stood empty, dust curling in the corners, sunlight leaking through the blinds in thin golden bars. Time had moved on, but one sound still haunted those walls, the final strike of Judge Helena Whitman's gavel, the moment when arrogance met its end. That day would always play back in slow motion. Aaron Mills stood motionless as the judge's voice cut through the silence. Life without parole. His smirk evaporated, the last trace of defiance drained from his face. In that instant, the boy who had mocked the court finally saw the weight of forever. The grin that had once fed on attention now trembled under it. The gavel fell again, and with it, every illusion of power he'd clung to. Reporters wrote that he looked unshocked, but those who were there knew better. Behind the blank stare was a kind of collapse, silent, invisible, but complete. As deputies led him out, he glanced back once, searching for a familiar face. There was none. The family he'd betrayed couldn't bear to look at him. He had become a ghost in his own story. Judge Whitman remained seated long after the courtroom emptied. She removed her glasses and whispered into the still air, "Justice isn't revenge. It's remembrance." For her, the verdict wasn't a victory. It was a vow that love and law must sometimes speak the same language. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft at first, then heavy, washing the courthouse steps clean. The crowd that had gathered didn't cheer. They simply stood there, faces lifted toward the storm, letting it fall. It was as if the entire town had needed that rain to breathe again. In the months that followed, Aaron disappeared into the machinery of the state, transferred to a high-security facility hundreds of miles away. No more interviews, no more headlines. His story was filed away, its chapters closed. He worked in the prison laundry, folded uniforms, watched the seasons change through a narrow slit of window. The arrogance that once filled a courtroom had nowhere left to go. Years later, an old guard would tell a journalist, "He doesn't smile anymore. He just listens when the lights go out, like he's waiting for something that never comes." Back in Willow Ridge, Lily built a life her mother would have been proud of. She married, had a child, named her daughter Sandra. The little girl's laughter filled the same library where her grandmother's memorial still stood. Every year on the anniversary of the sentencing, Lily brought flowers, not out of celebration, but out of gratitude that the story had finally found its end. Dylan grew old quietly. He rarely spoke about the trial. When he did, he said, "Justice didn't bring peace, but it brought direction." He found solace in helping other families through the grief of violent loss, reminding them that survival is its own kind of victory. Judge Whitman retired 5 years after the Mills case. On her final day, she walked once more into the empty courtroom, the same one where Aaron had smirked at her all those years before. She touched the bench lightly, then turned toward the door. "He thought he could outsmile consequence," she said softly, "but consequence smiles last." The plaque outside the courthouse bears a single line from her farewell speech. "Law restores order. Compassion restores meaning." And somewhere beyond the reach of cameras or applause, in a gray cell under a dim light, Aaron Mills wrote 3 words on the wall before lights out: "I was wrong." No one ever knew if he meant it as confession or exhaustion. But for those who'd lived through his crime, it didn't matter. Justice had already spoken. In Willow Ridge, the story became legend, not of horror, but of reckoning. Parents told their children, "Choices have echoes." Teachers spoke Sandra's name in classrooms, reminding students that arrogance has no age and empathy has no limit. Each spring, the town held Sandra's Day. Children planted wildflowers in the memorial garden. Lily would kneel beside her daughter, showing her how to press the soil down gently. "What are we doing this for, Mommy?" the girl once asked. "For kindness," Lily said, "so it doesn't fade." As the sun set behind the library, the wind stirred through the flowers. The air smelled of rain and renewal. And for the first time in more than a decade, the story of the Mills family felt whole, not healed, but held. Because in the end, the tale of the teen who mocked a judge wasn't about the smirk or the sentence. It was about the balance that always finds its way between cruelty and consequence, between a mother's love and the world's justice. And when the world remembered that courtroom, the smirk, the silence, the gavel, they remembered what came after: the fall of arrogance, the rise of truth, and the echo of a mother's courage that never died. He mocked the judge, he mocked the law. But when the gavel fell, the smile disappeared forever. If you believe justice was served, share her story, and remember that accountability, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way